Pariyatti Audiobooks presents Deconstructing Constructions, the Role of Saṅkhārā in the Buddha's Discourses, from Investigating the Dhamma by Bhikkhu Bodhi, narrated by Jonathan Nelson. Part 1. Introduction. In this paper, I intend to explore the Pali term Saṅkhārā, one of the pivotal concepts in the Buddha's Discourses. The Pali word has such a rich gamut of meanings that to merely draw them out into the open sheds a flood of light on the Buddha's understanding of reality. The word occurs in a variety of contexts that are subtly and intricately interwoven. To explore their contextual meanings and track down their interconnections will reveal the rigor of the Buddha's philosophical vision and the coherence of his teaching in expressing that vision in language and concepts. The noun Saṅkhārā, a plural form, is derived from the prefix saṅ, which suggests together, like the English prefix kan or kam. Joined to the noun kāra means deeds or acts. Etymologically, Saṅkhārā are thus co-doings. The corresponding verb saṅkhāroti, derived from the prefix saṅ, and the verb karoti, which is to make, to do, can mean to construct, to put together, to compose. Both the noun and the verb are sometimes augmented by another prefix, abi, to yield a substantive noun, abhisaṅkhārā, an action noun, abhisaṅkhārana, found only in the commentarial literature, and a verb, abhisaṅkhāroti. The addition of the prefix abhi usually suggests the involvement of conscious agency in the act of doing or making. This, however, is not invariably the case, and the word abhisaṅkhārā is found in instances when no conscious agency is involved. As we will see, the word saṅkhārā has both an active sense and a passive sense. This means that saṅkhārā are at once things that act in unison with other things to produce effects, and the things produced by the combined efficacy of those causal forces. Translators of Pali into English have rendered the word in a variety of ways: formations, confections, activities, processes, fabrications, forces, compounds, compositions, concoctions, determinations, synergies, constructions. All such renderings are clumsy attempts to capture the meaning of a concept for which Western thought has no exact parallel. However, though it may be impossible to discover an exact English equivalent for saṅkhārā, by exploring its usage in the texts, we can see how the word functions in the quote-unquote thought world of the Buddha's teachings. In this paper, I will focus primarily on the place of the saṅkhārā in the suttas, the discourses of the Buddha. On occasion, however, I will turn to the commentaries for clarification of the primary texts. In the suttas, we can distinguish four major doctrinal contexts in which the concept of saṅkhārā plays a major role. I will first explore these contexts individually. Then I will look at them in conjunction to see how a synoptic view of the saṅkhārā can help us understand the Buddha's understanding of actuality. Finally, I will relate these meanings to the end goal of the Buddha's teaching, the realization of nibbana, liberation from dukkha. Part 2. Saṅkhārā in Dependent Origination. One context where the word saṅkhārā frequently occurs is in the 12-fold formula of dependent origination, or paticca samuppada. Here, saṅkhārā is the second link in the series, conditioned by ignorance, avidya paccaya saṅkhārā, and serving as the condition for consciousness, saṅkhārā paccaya vijñānam. In the Discourses, The relationship between these three terms is usually expressed simply by this abstract formula, without the conceptual elaboration we would expect from a modern account of Buddhist doctrine. It is likely that the Buddha explained these relationships in greater detail, but when the compilers collected the texts, they may have reduced the diverse and more complex explanations to this terse formula as an aid to memorization and oral transmission. Several suttas, however, analyze the Saṅkhārā and thus shed light on the role they play in the process of dependent origination. Such texts slice up the Saṅkhārā in two complementary ways. One analysis distinguishes them by the way of the quote-unquote doors of action, the other by way of their ethical tone. Distinguished through door of action, the Saṅkhārā becomes threefold. Quote, "And what, monks, are the volitional activities? There are these three kinds of volitional activities: the bodily volitional activity, the verbal volitional activity, the mental volitional activity. These are called the volitional activities." End quote. The Sarātapakasini, the commentary to the Samyutta Nikāya, explains Saṅkhārā in this context as the act of quote-unquote volitionally constructing. It goes on to define the bodily volitional activity as the wholesome and unwholesome bodily volitions that instigate action through the door of body, the verbal volitional activity as the wholesome and unwholesome verbal volitions that instigate action through the door of speech, and the mental volitional activity as mundane wholesome and unwholesome mental volition that occurs solely in the mind, without instigating action through body or speech. In this role, the word Saṅkhārā is virtually synonymous with kamma, a word to which it is etymologically akin, both being derived from the word karoti, to act, to do, to make. Saṅkhārā may thus be understood as the inner volitional activity that creates kamma, deeds with the potential to produce results corresponding to their own moral quality. The connection between the two is reinforced by the well-known passage in which the Buddha says, quote, "It is volition, monks, that I call kamma. For having willed, that is, exercised volition, one acts by body, speech, and mind." End quote. The second scheme used to distinguish the Saṅkhārā in dependent origination is based on their ethical quality. This analysis is again threefold, as indicated by a text that not only lays down this threefold classification, but illuminates the interrelationship between the three types of Saṅkhārā, their condition, ignorance or avidya, and their fruit, consciousness or vijnana. Quote, "Monks, if a person immersed in ignorance constructs a meritorious volitional activity, consciousness fares on to the meritorious. If he constructs a demeritorious volitional activity, consciousness fares on to the demeritorious. If he constructs an imperturbable volitional activity, consciousness fares on to the imperturbable." End quote. The commentary explains meritorious volitional activity as the volition comprised in sense sphere wholesome states of consciousness, and the form sphere wholesome volition of the jhanas. Demeritorious volitional activity is the volition involved in unwholesome states of consciousness, and imperturbable volitional activity, the volition involved in the formless attainments. Of interest here is the verb abhisaṅkhāroti, which characterizes the activity of the quote-unquote person immersed in ignorance, and the suffix upaga, which characterizes the fate of consciousness under the influence of the Saṅkhārā. The verb abhisaṅkhāroti suggests that through the act of volition a person quote-unquote constructs a particular kind of volitional activity, meritorious, demeritorious, or imperturbable, which manifests through body, speech, or mind. It is noteworthy that ignorance underlies all such volitional activity, even that classified as meritorious and imperturbable. This reveals ignorance as the root of all activity pertaining to the round of birth and death, whether conventionally considered good or bad. Even wholesome deeds, when pursued for the sake of some karmic benefit, and even the imperturbable meditations, when underlaid by a subtle clinging, create a karmic potential that keeps one in bondage to the cycle of rebirths. The volitional activity generates a kamma, which in turn eventually bears fruit. The principal fruit of kamma may be conceived as the quote-unquote construction of a new state of existence in a realm appropriate to the generative kamma. But the saṅkhārā will also yield their particular fruits in the course of a lifetime. Using another metaphor, we might say that the volition infuses the state of consciousness with its own ethical quality, either meritorious, demeritorious, or imperturbable. And the consciousness so infused is then propelled to a new state of existence that corresponds to its ethical quality. We meet the suffix upagga in another formula often occurring in the Nikayas, which helps to illuminate its meaning in the passage under consideration. This other formula describes one of the higher knowledges accessible to the Buddha and the Arahants, the knowledge of the passing away and rebirth of beings. In describing his own attainment of enlightenment, the Buddha says, quote, "With the divine eye, purified and surpassing the human, I saw beings passing away and being reborn, inferior and superior, beautiful and ugly, fortunate and unfortunate. I understood how beings fare on according to their kamma." End quote. In this description, the suffix upagga signifies that beings quote-unquote fare on to the destination that accords with their kamma. Those who commit unwholesome deeds of body, speech, and mind move on toward the miserable destinations of rebirth. Those who do wholesome deeds move on toward the fortunate destinations of rebirth. The same principle should apply to Samyutta Nikaya, chapter 12, verse 51. In explicating this passage, the Samyutta commentary says that the volitional activity influences both kinds of consciousness, the karmically generative consciousness and the resultant consciousness. Thus, when one performs a meritorious deed, the meritorious volitional activity moves the consciousness associated with itself toward merit, imbuing consciousness with its own meritorious character. And so for the other two types of volitional activity. But this does not mark the end of the impact the volitional activities have on consciousness. Propped up by ignorance and fueled by craving, the saṅkhārā drive the stream of consciousness onward to a new birth. And exactly where consciousness winds up is determined by the ethical character of the saṅkhārā. If one engages in meritorious deeds, the saṅkhārā will propel consciousness toward a fortunate sphere of rebirth. If one engages in demeritorious deeds, the saṅkhārā will propel consciousness toward rebirth in a lower realm. And if one masters the formless meditations, the imperturbable saṅkhārā will propel consciousness toward rebirth in the formless realm. Part 3. Saṅkhārā as the fourth aggregate. A second major sphere to which the word saṅkhārā applies is the five aggregates, the fourth of which is the saṅkhāra khandha. This we may render as the, quote, aggregate of volitional activities, end quote. The texts explicitly define the saṅkhāra khandha as the 6 classes of volition. Quote, "And what, monks, are volitional activities? There are these 6 classes of volition: volition regarding forms, volition regarding sounds, volition regarding odors, volition regarding tastes, volition regarding tactile objects, volition regarding mental phenomena. These are called volitional activities." End quote. Though these saṅkhārā correspond closely to those in the formula of dependent origination, the two may not be identical in all respects. This is certainly the case according to the Abhidhamma and its commentaries, which consider the saṅkhārā khandha to be classifiable as karmically unwholesome, karmically wholesome, resultant, and merely functional. From this perspective, it is only the karmically unwholesome and wholesome volitions that are included in the second factor in the chain of dependent origination. Although this position is not explicitly stated in the suttas, it may be justified in the light of certain passages that show the saṅkhārā khandha to be integral to all experience. As a universal constituent of experience, the saṅkhārā khandha must encompass all kinds of volition, not only those that generate kamma. Since volition, or cetana, is one of the invariable factors in nama, quote, name, or mentality, a term that represents the factors present on any occasion of cognition, the saṅkhārā khandha must be present even on occasions of experience that are passive or inert in terms of their karmic potential. While the idea of quote-unquote resultant volition found in the Abhidhamma commentaries is not mentioned in the Nikayas, implicit support for the idea of karmically neutral saṅkhārā may be provided by the Mahahatthapādopama Sutta, spoken by Venerable Sariputta. In the second half of this sutta, after Sariputta has expounded on the four material elements, he goes on to explain how, in the genesis of any experience, all five aggregates come to be. In regard to visual experience, the exposition is as follows. Quote, "When internally the eye is intact, and external forms come into its range, and there is the corresponding mental engagement, then there is manifestation of the corresponding section of consciousness. The form in what has thus come to be is included in the form aggregate subject to clinging. The feeling in what has thus come to be is included in the feeling aggregate subject to clinging. The perception in what has thus come to be is included in the perception aggregate subject to clinging. The volitional activities in what has thus come to be are included in the volitional activities aggregate subject to clinging. The consciousness in what has thus come to be is included in the consciousness aggregate subject to clinging." End quote. Since the occasion being described is one when consciousness passively cognizes a visible form that has just entered the range of perception, we may assume that a response decisive enough to create kamma has not yet occurred. However, since the text speaks of the saṅkhārā khandha as already present, we might take the volitional activity on this occasion to be a type of response that operates at a pre-karmic level, perhaps as the rudimentary volition involved in the bare cognitive reception of the sense object. If we were to use the taxonomy of the Abhidhamma system, according to which eye consciousness and the other types of sensory consciousness is a resultant consciousness, we would call this a resultant type of volitional activity. As resultant, it would have to be excluded from the saṅkhārā factor of dependent origination, and yet as a type of volition, it would be comprised by the saṅkhārā khandha. Nevertheless, since the Buddha's teaching is not concerned with a purely objective analysis of experience for its own value, but with understanding how we create dukkha or suffering, his focus would have to be on the more active dimensions of the saṅkhārā khandha, especially as the engine that shapes the interpretation of cognitive events and drives the production of kamma. We will return to this aspect of the saṅkhārā khandha below. In the later Pali literature, beginning perhaps with the Dhammasangani, The Saṅkhārā Khanda serves as an umbrella category to which all mental factors can be assigned, with the exception of feeling and perception, which are aggregates in their own right. Thus, the Saṅkhārā Khanda is considered to include such ethically variable factors as thought, attention, mental unification, joy, and effort. Such wholesome factors as non-greed, non-hatred, moral shame, moral dread, compassion, mindfulness, and wisdom, and such unwholesome factors as greed, hatred, and delusion. Since all these factors arise in conjunction with volition, the early Buddhist teachers must have decided that the most fitting place to assign them is in the aggregate of volitional activities. While the suttas do not expressly assign these other factors to a place among the 5 aggregates, the ancient teachers must have felt that if the scheme of the aggregates is truly all-inclusive, a place must be found for the undetermined mental factors, and the 4th aggregate seemed to be the best candidate for this role. Part 4. Saṅkhārā as all conditioned things. The third sphere, in which the notion of saṅkhārā plays a major role, is indicated by the expression sabbe saṅkhārā, a designation for all conditioned things. According to the Pali commentaries, in this context the word denotes whatever is produced by conditions, whatever is conditioned, constructed, or fabricated. The commentaries designate these saṅkhārā as saṅkhata saṅkhārā, quote, saṅkhārā consisting in the conditioned, end quote. Saṅkhata being the past participle of the verb saṅkhāroti, from which the noun saṅkhārā is derived. Thus, the Abhidhamma commentary Sammohavinodani on page 135 states that, quote, all phenomena accompanied by conditions are saṅkhārā consisting in the conditioned, end quote. In this sense, the word might be rendered simply as conditioned phenomena. A subset of this category, according to the same passage of the Sammohavinodani, consists of the material and mental phenomena of the 3 planes of existence, specifically produced by kamma. These, it says, are called, in the ancient commentaries, quote, saṅkhārā consisting in the volitionally conditioned, end quote. That is, conditioned phenomena that are partly constructed by the activity of volition. This derivation would give the word saṅkhārā an essentially passive connotation. However, to view the saṅkhārā, taken in this most comprehensive sense, as inherently passive may impose on the term too constrictive a meaning. As an alternative, we might see saṅkhārā in this broad sense as functioning simultaneously in 2 roles, as both active conditions and as the conditioned phenomena constructed and sustained by conditions. Support for this perspective might be gleaned from at least 2 passages in the suttas. One supportive text is Samyutta Nikāya, chapter 48, verse 40, which discusses the 5 faculties connected with feeling and the stages where they, quote, cease without remainder, end quote. Here, the Buddha declares with respect to each of these faculties, quote, and that is with a basis, with an origin, with constructive activity, with a condition, end quote. Thus the word saṅkhārā, in what appears to be a situation where volitional activity is not necessarily involved, is collated with 3 other words that denote causation, nimitta, nidana, and paccaya, each qualified by the prefix sa, meaning along with, together with. Since the conditions or constructive activities productive of feeling could be the impact of the object, the acuity of the sense faculty, the act of attention, and so forth, we need not see the volitions of the Saṅkhārā Khanda as intended here. The other passage is a series of short suttas, in which it is said that bad, unwholesome qualities arise sanimitta, sanidana, sahituka, sa saṅkhārā, sa paccaya. Quote, with a basis, with an origin, with a cause, with constructive activity, with a condition. End quote. The sequence of terms, it will be noted, is identical with that in Samyutta Nikāya chapter 48, verse 40, but with the addition of hetuka, derived from hetu, meaning cause. Again, this indicates that saṅkhārā, in the broad sense, can be considered as also exercising an active function that is not necessarily tied to volition. On such an interpretation, which ascribes both causal activity and passivity to them, the saṅkhārā in the comprehensive sense could be regarded as nodes in a complex network of conditioning factors. Within this network, each node, each saṅkhārā, is connected to the others in a variety of ways. Each saṅkhārā, as conditioned, points backward to the cluster of past conditions from which it originates, but as an active condition, it also points forward to the future phenomena it helps to produce, and laterally to the cluster of present phenomena it helps to sustain. As conditioned phenomena, saṅkhārā include all 5 aggregates, not just the 4th aggregate. Thus, for instance, when the debater Saccaka asks the Buddha how he trains disciples, the Buddha replies, quote, form is impermanent, feeling is impermanent, perception is impermanent, volitional activities, or saṅkhārā, are impermanent, consciousness is impermanent, all saṅkhārā are impermanent. End quote. The same idea is enunciated in verses 277 and 278 of the Dhammapada. Quote, all conditioned phenomena are impermanent. All conditioned phenomena are suffering. When one sees this with wisdom, one becomes disenchanted with suffering. This is the path to purity. End quote. As these verses imply, the saṅkhārā serve as the epitome of dukkha, the first noble truth, encapsulating in one word its deeper meaning. When the Buddha summarizes the first noble truth by declaring, quote, in brief, the 5 aggregates subject to clinging are dukkha, end quote, he brings all conditioned phenomena into the range of dukkha. And all such phenomena are dukkha precisely because they are produced by conditions. In the Nikayas, we encounter a threefold analysis of dukkha. Dukkha entailed by suffering, dukkha intrinsic to conditioned phenomena, and dukkha entailed by change. The Sumangala Vilasini, the Digha Nikaya commentary, identifies the first as painful feeling, which is inherently suffering, and the third as pleasant feeling, which is unsatisfactory because subject to change. It identifies the second, saṅkhārā dukkhata, with neutral feeling that is neither painful nor pleasant, on the ground that such feeling is oppressed by arising, decay, and dissolution. The commentary adds, however, that because of the statement, quote, all saṅkhārā are dukkha, end quote, all phenomena of the 3 realms of existence, apart from painful and pleasant feeling, which fall under their own respective types of dukkha, are comprised in, quote, the dukkha intrinsic to conditioned phenomena, end quote. This way of distributing the 3 feelings among the 3 types of dukkha may still be too narrow and even contrary to the Nikayas. The Buddha himself says that when he declared, quote, whatever is felt is included in dukkha, end quote, he declared this with reference to the impermanence of the saṅkhārā. Thus, on the authority of this statement, all 3 types of feeling can be included in saṅkhārā dukkhata, the, quote, suffering intrinsic to conditioned phenomena, end quote. It is with reference to saṅkhārā in this sense that the Buddha issues his familiar exhortation to attain release from the cycle of rebirths, for instance, at Samyutta Nikāya chapter 15, verse 1. Quote, monks, this samsara is without discoverable beginning. A first point is not discerned of beings roaming and wandering unhindered by ignorance and fettered by craving. For such a long time, monks, you have experienced suffering, anguish, and disaster, and swelled the cemetery. It is enough, monks, to be disenchanted with all Saṅkhārā, enough to be dispassionate towards them, enough to be liberated from them." End quote. Since the wandering in samsara is maintained by ignorance and craving, the path to liberation, the path that will, quote-unquote, deconstruct the constructing and constructed phenomena of the Saṅkhārā, devolves upon the task of eliminating ignorance and craving. This requires vigorous effort, and thus in his last exhortation, the Buddha again stressed the same point. Quote, "Saṅkhārā are subject to vanish. Achieve the goal by heedfulness." End quote. Part 5. The Sequential Cessation of Saṅkhārā. A fourth domain to which the word Saṅkhārā applies is the stages of meditation. The term Saṅkhārā here refers to certain factors that are to be gradually stilled as one progresses through the successive levels of meditative attainment. We find this usage in the Ānapāna Sutta, where the first tetrad speaks about, quote, pacifying the bodily activity, end quote, and the second tetrad about, quote, pacifying the mental activity, end quote. But the fullest treatment of this group of Saṅkhārā is the Chula Vidala Sutta, which takes the form of a dialogue between the nun Dhammadinna and the layman Visakha. Here, the bodily Saṅkhārā, a grammatical singular, is identified with inhalation and exhalation, quote, because these things are bodily, dependent on the body, end quote. The verbal Saṅkhārā is identified with thought and examination, quote, because first one thinks and examines, and then breaks out into speech, end quote. The mental Saṅkhārā is identified with perception and feeling, quote, because these things are mental, dependent on the mind, end quote. In the development of deeper meditative states, the verbal Saṅkhārā ceases with the attainment of the second jhana, in which thought and examination subside. The bodily Saṅkhārā ceases with the attainment of the fourth jhana, in which breathing stops. And the mental Saṅkhārā ceases with, quote, the attainment of the cessation of perception and feeling, end quote. This scheme, which relates Saṅkhārā to the progressive stages of meditation, is subsumed under the project of bringing certain Saṅkhārā to an end, both tentatively in higher meditative attainments and permanently through wisdom. In the sutta in which the Buddha designates all three types of feeling as dukkha, because of their impermanence, he goes on to introduce what he calls, quote, a sequential cessation of Saṅkhārā, end quote. Thus, for one who enters the first jhana, speech has ceased. For one who attains the second jhana, thought and examination have ceased. And so, in each of the attainments beyond this, successively more subtle factors cease until one attains, quote, the cessation of perception and feeling, end quote, when perception and feeling and all other mental activities cease. But even this attainment does not mark the end of the sequence, for such cessation is only temporary. Beyond even this exalted meditative state, the sutta says, lies the attainment of arahantship. It is in the arahant that, quote, lust has ceased, hatred has ceased, and delusion has ceased, end quote. Thus, lust, hatred, and delusion are here depicted as the most stubborn Saṅkhārā of all, those particular phenomena at once constructing and constructed that drive the process of becoming. And the goal of the spiritual life is held up as the cessation of lust, hatred, and delusion, fully achieved only by the arahant. Part 6. A synoptic perspective on the Saṅkhārā. The fact that Saṅkhārā can include both active forces and the things produced by them secures for the term a role as the cornerstone of the Buddha's philosophical vision. What the Buddha teaches is that the Saṅkhārā, in the two active senses, the volitional activities, operative independent origination, and the karmically creative volitional activities in the fourth aggregate, construct Saṅkhārā as the volitionally produced conditioned phenomena comprised in the five aggregates. These latter can also be expressed as the particular personhood, or attabhava, we acquire as we take up one existence after another in the round of birth and death. This role of the Saṅkhārā can be illustrated by two passages, one pertaining to Saṅkhārā as the second factor of dependent origination, the other to Saṅkhārā as the fourth among the five aggregates. The passage I have in mind pertaining to dependent origination, however, does not employ the standard 12-fold formula, but a unique variant. The use of such variants demonstrates that the terms in the familiar 12-term series should not be seen as locked into a fixed and invariable sequence, but as participants in a complex process that can be viewed from a variety of angles. This particular sutta, in Samyutta Nikāya, chapter 12, verse 64, begins with the quote-unquote four nutriments: material food, contact, mental volition, and consciousness. It continues thus, quote, "If there is lust, delight, and craving for any of the four nutriments, consciousness is established there and comes to growth. Wherever consciousness is established and comes to growth, there is a descent of name and form. Where there is a descent of name and form, there is the growth of Saṅkhārā. Where there is the growth of Saṅkhārā, there is production of future renewed existence. Where there is production of future renewed existence, there is future birth, old age, and death. Where there is future birth, old age, and death, that, I say, is accompanied by sorrow, anguish, and despair." End quote. In this passage, the Saṅkhārā follow upon consciousness and name and form rather than preceding them as in the standard formula. We can thus infer that these are the volitional activities that occur after a new life has begun, that is, after craving has propelled the stream of consciousness into a new existence, which, like any existence, consists in the interplay of consciousness and name and form. But once the new life starts, and consciousness and name and form begin to weave around each other, fresh volitional activities emerge, constructing still another existence in the future, a life that begins with birth and continues into old age and death. The sutta illustrates the constructive role of the volitional activities in shaping the new existence with the fitting simile of artistic creation. Quote, "Suppose an artist, using paint of different colors, would create the figure of a man or a woman complete in all its features on a well-polished plank or wall or canvas. So too, if there is lust and craving for any of the four nutriments, consciousness is established there and comes to growth. That, I say, is accompanied by sorrow, anguish, and despair." End quote. The second passage I wish to consider is found in the Kajjaniya Sutta, in Samyutta Nikāya, chapter 22, verse 79, a discourse that attempts to explain the functions of each of the five aggregates. Here, the Buddha assigns to the Saṅkhārā Khandha a constructive role in relation to all five aggregates. The relevant passage relies on a convergence of word forms that is notoriously hard to replicate in translation. The text begins by raising the question, why does one call them Saṅkhārā? The answer given, in Pali, is Saṅkhatam abhisaṅkhāratiti ko bhikkhave tasma saṅkhārati vucati. To capture the subtle wordplay in this answer, I will render saṅkhāra by the clumsy expression constructive volitional activities. The reason they are called constructive volitional activities might then be translated: they volitionally construct the constructed, monks, therefore they are called constructive volitional activities. The text next asks, what is the constructed that they volitionally construct? And in reply, it asserts, quote, they volitionally construct constructed form in accordance with the nature of form. They volitionally construct constructed feeling in accordance with the nature of feeling. They volitionally construct constructed perception in accordance with the nature of perception. They volitionally construct constructed volitional constructions in accordance with the nature of volitional constructions. They volitionally construct constructed consciousness in accordance with the nature of consciousness. They volitionally construct the constructed, therefore they are called constructive volitional activities. End quote. Though external inanimate objects may arise from purely physical causes, from the evidence of this passage we can infer that the saṅkhāra that make up our personal being, the 5 aggregates, are all products of the karmically active saṅkhāra generated in our previous lives as well as those being fashioned in our present life. Thus, the Buddha teaches it was our own karmically constructive saṅkhāra that have built up our present edifice of personal being, and it is our present constructive saṅkhāra that are building up the edifices of personal being we will inhabit in future lives. These quote-unquote edifices consist of nothing other than the saṅkhāra as the conditioned phenomena comprised in the 5 aggregates. These go on conditioning each other throughout our present life, and via the saṅkhāra of the 4th aggregate, build up still more edifices of being in future lives, until they are finally disabled, or quote-unquote deconstructed. Part 7. Deconstructing Constructions. The most important fact to understand about saṅkhāra as conditioned phenomena is that they are all impermanent. As stated in the famous verse recited at Buddhist funerals, impermanent, alas, are conditioned things. Anicca vata saṅkhāra. They are impermanent not only in the sense that in their gross manifestations they will eventually cease to be, but even more pointedly, because at the subtle level they constantly undergo rise and fall. Forever they are coming into being and then breaking up and perishing. Hence, quote, their very nature is to arise and vanish. End quote. For this reason, the Buddha declares that all saṅkhāra are suffering. Sabbe saṅkhāra dukkha. Suffering, however, not because they are all actually painful and stressful, but because they are stamped with the mark of transience. Quote, having arisen, they then cease. End quote. And because they all cease, they cannot provide stable happiness and security. To win complete release from dukkha, one must attain release not only from experiential suffering, but from the unsatisfactoriness intrinsic to all conditioned existence. This is the aspect of dukkha highlighted by the expression saṅkhāra dukkha, the dimension of suffering inseparable from conditioned phenomena. What lies beyond the saṅkhāra is that which is asaṅkhata, unconditioned, not constructed, not put together, not compounded by saṅkhāra. And that which is not compounded by saṅkhāra is nibbana. Nibbana is designated the unconditioned precisely because it is a state that is neither itself a saṅkhāra nor one constructed by a saṅkhāra. It is a state reached when, as stated in Dhammapada verse 154, all craving is destroyed, and the mind reaches the deconstruction, the deactivation, the disabling of constructive activities. Nibbana is also designated Sabba Saṅkhārā Samatha, quote, the stilling of all conditioned phenomena, end quote. How this stilling is accomplished is described in the sutta referred to earlier at Samyutta Nikāya, chapter 12, verse 51. After the Buddha has classified the Saṅkhārā of dependent origination by way of their ethical quality, he goes on to explain how a monk stops constructing Saṅkhārā and thereby reaches Nibbana. Quote, but when a monk has abandoned ignorance and aroused true knowledge, then, with the fading away of ignorance and the arising of true knowledge, he does not construct a meritorious volitional activity, or a demeritorious volitional activity, or an imperturbable volitional activity. Since he does not construct or fashion volitions, he does not cling to anything in the world. Not clinging, he is not agitated. Not being agitated, he personally attains Nibbana. He understands, destroyed is birth, the holy life has been lived. What had to be done has been done. There is no more for this state of being. End quote. This passage indicates that the Saṅkhārā are to be finally deconstructed, not by suppression, not by a forceful attempt to destroy them, but by arousing true knowledge. And as we learn from many other texts, true knowledge arises through the practice of the Noble Eightfold Path, or the sequential training in virtuous conduct, concentration, and wisdom. When such knowledge arises, it eliminates the ignorance and craving that underlie the process of karmic activity, and thereby brings to an end both the constructing activity of present Saṅkhārā and the construction of future Saṅkhārā. This liberates one from bondage to the round of births, so that one comes no more to, quote, this state of being, end quote, to any state of, quote unquote, thisness in the three realms of existence. Thus, when we put the word Saṅkhārā under the microscope, we can see compressed within it the entire world view of the Dhamma. The active Saṅkhārā, consisting in karmically active volitions, perpetuate the Saṅkhārā of the five aggregates that constitute a sentient being. We identify with the five aggregates because of ignorance, and we seek enjoyment in them because of craving. On account of ignorance and craving, we engage in volitional activities that build up future combinations of the five aggregates, which in total are all Saṅkhārā, and these become our personal identities in successive lives. Just that is the nature of samsara, an unbroken procession of empty but efficient Saṅkhārā producing still other Saṅkhārā, rising up in fresh waves with each new birth, swelling to a crest, and then crashing down into old age, illness, and death. Yet on it goes, shrouded in the delusion that we're really in control, sustained by an ever-tantalizing, ever-receding hope of final satisfaction. When, however, we take up the practice of the Dhamma, we apply a brake to this relentless generation of Saṅkhārā. Through wisdom, we remove ignorance. Through renunciation, we remove craving. We see with wisdom the true nature of the Saṅkhārā, of our own five aggregates, as unstable, conditioned processes rolling on with no essential persisting self in charge. Thereby, we switch off the engine driven by ignorance and craving, and the process of karmic construction, the production of active Saṅkhārā, is effectively shut down. By putting an end to the constructing of conditioned reality, we open the door to what is ever present but not constructed, not conditioned, the asaṅkhāra dhatu, the unconditioned element. This is Nibbana, the deathless, the subsiding of constructive volitional activities, final liberation from all conditionings, and thus from impermanence and death. Therefore, the popular verse concludes, quote, the subsiding of Saṅkhārā is blissful, end quote. This has been Deconstructing Constructions, the Role of Saṅkhārā in the Buddha's Discourses, from Investigating the Dhamma by Bhikkhu Bodhi, narrated by Jonathan Nelson. Copyright 2015, Buddhist Publication Society. Audio production copyright 2024, Pariyatti. Pariyatti, a non-profit 501c3 organization, offers a wide variety of books, eBooks, videos, and audiobooks about the teachings of the Buddha, the Pali language, and Vipassana meditation. Browse our complete catalog at www.pariyatti.org.